What is happening, everybody? So, in this video, I want to chat about a car that is very near and dear to my heart, and that would be the 4th gen Camaros. Look, back in the day, that 4th gen could be optioned with the LT1 350 small block, and it was lifted from the Corvette, albeit detuned slightly. That was one of the most fun cars to drive. I have some very fond memories of playing around in those things when I was a kid. And the thing about that car that was so great is that it represents a very crucial point in American muscle car history. It is the last offering of the LT1 in a pony car by Chevrolet. And what that basically means is it's the send-off to the old school 350, the 350 that lends its lineage all the way back to the 1950s. And we're not talking about an engine that's just an icon. It is the icon with which all other small blocks are compared. So Chevrolet had to do something equally iconic to replace that engine. And when they released that car with the LS1, that was the jumping point for that particular engine platform. Yes, it was offered in the Corvette, but what made that engine even that much more special was that that same Corvette engine was offered in the Camaro. And when we're talking about engines, you know, car guys will talk about horsepower, torque, horsepower per cubic inch, RPM. All of that are, or all of those things are topics of conversation, but when you mention one thing to any muscle car guy, especially an old school guy, well, that would be aluminum block. If that phrase comes up in conversation, that immediately almost takes precedent over everything else. And Chevrolet could have done just as well by throwing an iron block 5.7 into that car. But they didn't. They stuck with an aluminum block for the Camaros. And well, it makes sense. I mean, the 5.7 was always a performance-derived engine. So, yeah, they didn't just, go away from that formula for the Camaro, but the fact that they never did make an iron block 5.7 for that car is amazing to me. Because it could have done just as well. It would have sold just as well. Performance, well, if you didn't know any better, you would probably never have known whether you had an iron block or an aluminum block. But the fact is, it had the exotic buzzword of aluminum block tagged to it. So there was always that. And because that LS1 was offered in a performance car, that is what kept that car alive for as long as it was. I mean, we did lose it in 2002, only to be replaced 5 years later with the Gen 5. But that Gen 4, well, it just represented so many cool things about an American pony car. But another first that it gave us was the 6-speed manual. And no other pony car had ever had a 6-speed manual up to that point. And with that came, well, you got the sense that Chevrolet was giving you something more. Where the Ford was, at this stage of the game, giving you an anemic 4.6-liter V8 with a 5-speed in the GT cars, well, you could get the LS1 with a 6-speed manual. And, well, quite frankly, or I should say honestly, if nothing else, Ford had to just lay down and get stomped by the Camaro up until 2002 when the Camaro was discontinued. And at that point, the Mustang had a monopoly until 2008 when the Challenger was released. But, the fact remains that there were so many Gen 4s out and about doing all types of track events back then. I remember at one point in my life, I was big into autocross, and you would see Gen 4s on the autocross. Of course, I would see them at the drag strip. You would see them on the streets just tearing it up. And they were such a great platform because they had such a durable powertrain. It seems like, aside from the rear end, you could basically beat those cars mercilessly. And they never gave up the ghost. And that was something that was always really cool. You still had all the torque of that. Well, if you had an LT1, the LT1, or you had all that power and the weight savings with the LS1, there was always something to talk about, and it was always positive with those cars. Now, again, the Gen 4 did introduce the pony car enthusiast to the LS1, and because of that, well, the aftermarket, as it took to the LS1, started finding out that you could get a ton of power out of that little compact LS platform. Next thing you knew, you had mid-11-second LS1 cars going down the drag strip, and it seemed to me that it happened overnight, and it just basically turned the pony car on its head. And again, there was really no answer from Ford at the time, at least in the GT class of cars. And because of that, it was basically Chevrolet carrying a monopoly on performance. And again, it did something that the Fords didn't do. They retained the old school hot rodder. Because it was still a pushrod platform, well, it was something that the old school guys could still at least relate to. And when Ford went to that modular setup, man, old school guys took a look at that and went, what the hell is this? And it turned, well, the LS platform, it turned a lot of Ford guys into Chevy guys overnight when that modular engine was released. And again, comparing engine to engine real quickly, I mean, there's just no comparison. I mean, LS versus 4.6, well, the 4.6 at its best is making somewhere around 260 horsepower, give or take. Well, the LS might have been making 275, but it had torque everywhere. And the thing about it was that's just where you got your start. They were easily upgradable. And with just a cam swap and a better set of valve springs, you could go from making 275 to close to 400 horsepower to the flywheel without having to break the bank. And that was something that there was just no answer for from Ford, again, in the GT class of cars. So, when you take all of that into account and you look at the Camaro, by today's standard, it's not the numbers aren't all that impressive, but you've got to look at it as a blank canvas. When I see one of those cars, I don't see what it can do. I see what it will do with not that much of an investment in time and parts. So, to me, I don't know that I would ever own one just because, the project life cycle, the way that it is, I just don't know if I'll ever get around to it. But when I do see guys that have made the commitment to those cars, it kind of makes me wish I would have picked one up. And that seems to be a common thing with a lot of cars, but I've got to tell you that Gen 4, because it represents so many cool places in history and how it still was able to retain old school hot rodders, and it introduced us to an aluminum block, small block V8, and the 6-speed manual, it did so many cool things that you'd almost not want to tear one up. I mean, you'd almost want to take one and restore it to stock. Just drive the thing around and enjoy it and have some fun. But let's be honest, that's not really the whole point of those cars. So, at any rate, those are just some of my rambling thoughts about the Gen 4. Love to hear your experiences with them. Post up your comments and let me know about them. And that's a wrap on this one. Y'all have a great one. Adios.